Leo, how and why did you get involved in cult-related matters?
I have fortunately no personal involvement. My husband was working for the American Jewish Committee in Interreligious Affairs, and he started getting phone calls from Jewish parents whose kids were in something called the Moonies. And Jim knew nothing about Unification Church or cults, but he became the cult expert in the Jewish community, and he knew nothing. So we decided, I was at home with small children and decided to begin a writing career, and we saw that there were no books about cults, and so we decided to write one. And it became it was one of the first books about cults. Now there are, tons of them. And we became sort of sucked into the countercult community at the time. Now this was around 1979, 1980, because Jonestown is in our book. And it was at the very beginning of the Cult Awareness Network and before the American Family Foundation. So that's how I got sort of sucked in. And then Jim was told by the American Jewish Committee that this was really not part of his job, and so he officially stopped doing this, but still with me remained unofficially involved. So we had no personal involvement. Then when my older daughter was ready for college, my husband said, "The party's over. You have to get a job to help pay the tuition," and so. I became one of the few paid people in this profession, and when I say paid, I'm speaking euphemistically, practically.
What was the actual connection? How did it happen?
Well, at that point, I was involved with AFF from the beginning, and
how did that happen? Actually, there you were. You wrote the book. Did somebody contact you?
Someone must have that's a good question. Now, I know we got involved in what became the Cult Awareness Network. One day, Jim was speaking in Chicago for the American Jewish Committee. This was after we wrote our book, but before we became involved in any organization. And a beautiful blonde woman ran into his room, threw her arms around him, and kissed him. It was Lila Scales. One of the founders of the Cult Awareness Network, and I think she got us involved in that, in the New York, New Jersey chapter. Now, how we got, that's really a good question. Someone must have contacted us. And we were not at the first AFF gathering. We were in Israel that year, but we were at the next one. So this goes back, well, as you know, 40 years.
Yeah. What specific ICSA programs have you been involved in since those days, and what services may you have provided?
Well, when I started working officially, I was the preventive education specialist. And of course, this was before the internet, before the computers. And so this meant going around to high schools or colleges, talking to 30 people. I did a huge amount of traveling. I networked with national organizations such as the college security guards, that sort of thing. I did a lot of speaking. That was my official position. I founded what became known as the International Cult Education Program. I also put out a newsletter. We published things. We wrote a book about cults on campus. I edited that. Now, of course, with the growth of the internet, that sort of traveling around and talking to 30 high school kids isn't necessary anymore, and really wasn't that effective. Then I became the telephone answerer. I was the first person people contacted. This was, as I say, before the internet, before you could type in the word cults and get help that way. And so I did the preventive education, as well as I was the first contact people called. And I steered them to resources. And I am not a mental health professional, I'm not a counselor, so that I couldn't do, but I steered them to the right people, told them about our books and our other resources. And that's what I spent most of my 10 or so years doing. When I left, the internet was just starting, and so of course that position really isn't necessary anymore, although I guess someone still answers the phone. But it was all sort of hearsay. People would hear me perhaps, or someone else in the movement, on the radio, on a radio show, pull their car over to the curb, write down the telephone number, and call. And in those days, that was the only way people could get help.
How, if at all, did the connection with AFF and then laterally ICSA, how did it affect your understanding and approach to cults?
From the beginning, this organization had a different approach than the predominantly parental Cult Awareness Network. The Cult Awareness Network, and I'm talking about the old one, not the new one that the Scientologists was started, was primarily parents of cult members, very irate and upset, as you could understand. They did not have a research, they did not have a professional research point of view. There were very few mental health professionals involved. It was mostly parents kind of trying to help each other the best way they could. The American Family Foundation was based on a more objective approach, a more less emotionally charged approach, always from the beginning, a more balanced approach and more research oriented.
I'm interested also in how it affected your approach intellectually to these issues, if at all. Maybe it didn't.
I became more balanced in my point of view, in terms of the fact, for example, that some people benefit from the membership or aren't harmed that much. It affected my point of view in that I became more objective and more rationally able to deal with these parents and people who called. Of course, by then, you have to understand, it wasn't just parents and their 20-year-old college students getting involved in the cults, parents trying to get them out. It transitioned into now, of course, there's children trying to get their parents out, loved ones trying to get loved ones. It changed the whole situation. So the balanced point of view of the American Family Foundation, because I, as one of the first people involved in it, had no personal involvement. Herb Rosedale had no personal involvement. Michael Langone, all of the there were a few founders of AFF who, yes, did have family involvements, but I think the fact that most of us running it didn't left us with a better balanced view. And Michael Langone, being a clinical psychologist, has professionalized the whole movement, and I think really uplifted it to another dimension.
I was going to ask you whether you tried to educate your professional peers or the public. I think you really answered that question.
I tried to educate the public. We tried. My husband's a rabbi, and we're Jewish. Of course, we tried to get the rabbis involved. They were quite resistant to it, and as of now, presently, I know of no counter-cult or cult education programs for the Jewish community.
You remember we went to the attorney, civil rights attorney for the AJC, met with him. I can't think of his name now, and he commiserated with the problems, but said this was an area they couldn't go into because of the issue of civil rights.
Well, they were very leery about it, and in my early days, they did educate a lot of Jewish schools and things, but now most rabbis would not even know anything about it. We also tried among the other religious communities. Interestingly, very few clergy, as you know, have been involved in this.
I remember the Catholic Archdiocese of Brooklyn and of New York were interested. Remember Father, I can't think of his name. He was a big man in Manhattan. Somebody thought he'd become a cardinal someday. O'Brien was his name.
Ed O'Brien.
Was it?
My husband knew.
Yeah.
But in a way that's kind of good, because the ex-members coming out of religiously based groups were resentful of clergy being there. It's interesting. We were always upset that we didn't have enough clergy involved. We had a few priests and things, and my husband. But these young people at that time, they were young people, they were what we would now call spiritually abused. We didn't have a term for it. They really, the last thing they wanted was to be counseled by a clergy person. So in a way, it was sort of fortunate that they were not involved. There are now in ICSA, there are people oriented towards the spiritual abuse aspect. Many very committed Christians who are steering some of these ex-members of some of these groups into what they consider a more fruitful spiritual. But on the whole, we were fairly unsuccessful with the religious community on this issue.
What mistakes or an approach or practice do you think AFF and ICSA have made that might be avoided?
In terms of ICSA, or what used to be AFF, I can't think of any mistakes. I'm sorry. I'm just not an objective observer. The organization has been run on a shoestring. I think it's done remarkably. We were at several points on the edge of extinction, as you know. We focus on volunteer work. I don't know if anybody actually ever really took my place in terms of my huge salary. I think it has done remarkably well. I think due to the leadership of Herb Rosedale, who was so insightful, he brought in occult groups into our dialogue. At one point, he invited, as you probably know, the Hare Krishna organization to actually not only come to the conferences, but to participate. They had a very large session. And so this sort of, the cults have never looked at this organization as the enemy like they did the old Cult Awareness Network, which, as your viewers know, no longer exists because it was sued. And I just can't really think of any mistakes. There have been a few problems in communication among various factions, but I think they're trying to address that. I mean, you have a lot of young people, you have ex-members, now you have all these people who've grown up in groups which have totally different issues. And I think, considering all the problems involved in the diversity of the people who partake of the services, they've really done remarkable jobs. I worry a little bit about the leadership. Michael Angoni's not going to be young and forever. What's going to happen after him? I think some of these young people who I've met at these conferences are really astonishingly wonderful and efficient, and they're professionalizing themselves. They're becoming therapists and things, and doing the research themselves. So hopefully we will have a good future.
Do you think that there's any way in which the bringing in the young people, what might facilitate bringing in the younger people?
I don't know. I know we have a really wonderful website, done of course voluntarily, that helps to bring people in. It's a very clear and easy to navigate. I've dealt with organizations in my other work lives which have been impossible to navigate. I'm sure you've come across those too. I think that helps. I think that the organization has become very welcoming to the young people and to the ex-members. And not all ex-members are young people, as you know. They can be middle-aged and older people that leave. And I think the organization's become more welcoming to them, more sensitive to their needs. For example, we always have a help staff available, professional therapists. If someone is triggered or feels uncomfortable, I know that they can participate in those benefits.
Yeah.
So we do probably have to work a little more on that. I know as an old timer in this movement, I tend to navigate towards my old friends, and I don't introduce myself to the new people, not that maybe they care about who I am anyway. Sometimes I'll get a young person who has heard of me, and that's very exciting, heard of the work that I've done. But of course that's becoming less so as the years go by. But I think maybe we old timers have to sort of extend ourselves and get to know some of these new people that are active.
Yeah. Right. Well, I think they can wrap it up.
Oh, good.
Unless,
Okay.
and if there's anything else you want to comment on, that's fine. That's fine.
Well, just like to say, I've been involved, I'm not so personally involved in the day-to-day, I'm not in the boards or anything now, but I've witnessed really a transition in the whole countercult movement, which I think has been very beneficial, and plus an outreach to the people who don't believe in our work, who have tried to, in the past, discount our work, say that it's not intellectually valid. I think we're making progress in that field. The public doesn't seem to be, every time I say I'm going to, for example, this conference, oh, cults, are they still around? You always get that. And then I have to give my 5 minutes summary speech. But perhaps the education of the public could be, we need a little more of that. But now we've had some of these ex-members in these big TV shows and sort of, so I don't need to go around and talk to 30 high school kids anymore. I think we need the public education, but I've seen a big change in the movement, and I think positively.
Great. Well, thank you very
So,
much.
that's it?
That's it.
Okay.